Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. It's lovely to see you all. And today I am joined by Dr. Sophus Hell, who is going to talk to us about Enheduanna, who is a wonderful figure, and we always get a lot of questions about her. So I'm sure this is going to be an excellent episode. Sophus, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, no, it's a joy. Before we get started, could you just introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are, what you do, and how you got into your particular field?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm an Assyriologist and a literary critic. I'm currently a postdoc at Freie Universität Berlin, which is where I'm sitting. I'm also a columnist or literary critic for the Danish newspaper Weekendavisen. And yeah, I do specialize in Babylonian epic poetry, especially, as well as in Enheduanna, but I also like to dabble in other kinds of ancient literature.
Thank you. And you just published a new translation of Gilgamesh, I believe.
That is correct, and so these are the two works that I focused most on: the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh and the collected poems of Enheduanna. Those are the two main specialties I have, and like it's interesting for me to be talking about Enheduanna right now because for me this is Gilgamesh month at the moment because we're counting down to the 150th anniversary of the modern rediscovery of Gilgamesh. So it's good to mix things up.
And it's incredibly exciting. And for those who are on Twitter, Sophus has been doing daily tweets of information about Gilgamesh and translation reception and the discovery. And it's really fascinating reads. So definitely, if you're interested, go and look at that. And actually, you're part of a panel on December 9th about
Yes.
Gilgamesh. Do you want to just briefly give some information about that? Because I'm sure there are going to be people in the audience who are interested.
Sure thing. So, as I said, it's the 150th anniversary that is coming up, and it's December 3rd specifically that this Assyriologist named George Smith in 1872 presented his findings of this epic and brought it to life for the first time to a modern audience. So we're celebrating that in all sorts of ways. There will be various events. There is a Zoom Q&A on December 3rd itself. It's a Saturday, so it's a great day to be celebrating. I'm very happy about that. And then on December 6th, we have a wonderful panel in London with Selena Wisdom and Walid Siti and Jenny Lewis. And yeah, I think that'll be a really fun event, and it's also being streamed live.
I'm going to put, for those who are interested, I will put details about how to attend those events if you would like to, because I'm going to try and get to the panel because it looks wonderful. I love Dr. Wisdom as well, so it will be delightful. Anyway, we should talk about Enheduanna. Can you tell us who she is? Why is she important? Why should we care about her?
Absolutely. So Enheduanna is first and foremost a real historical person. She was the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, who is credited with having created the world's first empire by uniting these Sumerian and Akkadian-speaking cities in what is now southern Iraq under one state for the first time. Previously, they were these independent city-states, but Sargon puts them together or reunites them to create this empire that we modern scholars call the Old Akkadian Empire. And Sargon then installs his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Sin, or Nanna, in the city of Ur. So that's down south. It would have been a coast city at the time, a very big, rich city. And so Enheduanna holds this position of high priestess, which is an immensely prestigious and influential position. Just exactly what and high priestess did is a debated topic, but certainly I'm convinced that this was a position of great power and prestige. And so also as the daughter of the emperor, she would have essentially acted as a representative of the empire in its southern corner. So I'm quite convinced that she would have been possibly the most important female person of her day, or the one of at least.
Just quickly, what evidence do we have for her? Because I will get into the writings a little bit later, but what evidence do we have for her from her own time?
Sure thing. So just to preempt that later discussion, the reason we're talking about Enheduanna is that besides being a historical person, there are also these works of amazing literature that are attributed to her that make her the first known author in human history. We'll get into those attributions and those texts in a moment, but just if we concentrate on the historical person, what do we know about her? It's a mixture of nothing at all and surprisingly a lot. So the main evidence for her being a real historical person is this disc, the disc of Enheduanna, which carries an inscription on the back that identifies her as Enheduanna. And on that inscription, I just love that she presents herself as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna, the ritual spouse. She calls herself the wife of Nanna because in some rituals she would have acted as the ritual wife of the god. And then she says the daughter of Sagan. And if I were the daughter of the world's most most powerful man, I might mention that first, but that's not her style. She goes for her job title first, and I do love that about her. So this is the other side of the disc that we're currently seeing. This is a reconstruction that's quite heavy-handed. We don't know how accurate this reconstruction is, but the woman in the center, who is luckily the best preserved, is Enheduanna. And so we get a glimpse of how at least she would have styled herself. Now, what's quite interesting is that in the poems that are attributed to her, she has a special devotion to the goddess Inanna, in Akkadian Ishtar. And this disc shows us that the real historical person really did have a devotion to this goddess. That's not a literary fiction. So she would have served the moon god Nanna. But what this disc shows is that she is presenting an altar, a new altar to the goddess Inanna. That's what the disc is commemorating. An altar called the Table of Heaven. So if you go up again, what we're seeing here is the person in front of her is a priest, and he is pouring out a liquid. It's called a libation, so a liquid offering onto this altar. So this is what we're celebrating with this altar. Sorry, with this disc. So that's one source of evidence for Enheduanna being a real historical person. The other main sources of evidence are these cylinder seals. So as I'm sure many of your listeners or people watching this will know, cylinder seals were basically an ancient kind of like a signature or personal identification. These were cylinders about this tall, carried around your neck that you would use to sign a document or something like that. You would roll it, and some of them are just have pictures on them that like identify them as being unique objects, so you can say, oh, this person signed this document, and some of them also, like this one, have a bit of text on them that identify who this person is. And there are 4 cylinder seals that we have recovered that belong to Enheduanna's servants. So we have 2 by her scribes. One of the scribe is called Sagadu, the other part of the name is lost, but it ended in Kitushtu. We also have the cylinder seal of her steward, so the person who took care of her estate. He's called Adda. And most wonderfully, we have the cylinder seal of her hairdresser, her kinda, as it's called in Sumerian, who was called Ilumpalil. And the wonderful thing about that is that this was found in Ilumpalil's actual grave. So we have the grave goods of a hairdresser, which is fantastic. Like, we know so little about her, and yet we have the belongings of her hairdresser. And that's what I mean, a combination of nothing at all. We don't know when she was born, we don't know how old she was when she died, but we have these weird glimpses into her life. And she lived 4,300 years ago. The fact that we know anything about her is pretty miraculous.
It's quite impressive, and I didn't know that we had the seal from her hairdresser. That's really lovely. I enjoy that.
Like in that grave, there are also some cutting tools, and I like to imagine
Oh.
like an alternative reality in which they find a hair, and then maybe it was her hair. Jurassic Park scene. That's not actually going to happen. Sci-fi imagination clone in Enheduanna.
Oh, wonderful. So when we look at the texts, then what texts are we talking about that are attributed to her?
So there are 5 texts that are attributed to her, literary works. So 2 of them I'm going to sort of be discounting for the purposes of this conversation, just because they are so fragmentary. Some information can be gotten out of them, but I think that muddies the pictures for now. So we're concentrating on 3 of them: the exaltation of Inanna, the hymn to Inanna, and the temple hymns. So the first 2, the exaltation and the hymn, they are hymns to the goddess Inanna, much like the title suggests. And Inanna is again the same goddess known in Akkadian as Ishtar, that the altar was dedicated to. And Inanna is the most amazing goddess. As again, I'm sure many of your listeners will know, she is the goddess of sex and of war, of transformation, of destruction, of paradox, of contradiction, and those more like paradoxical, transformative aspects of Inanna really come to the fore in Enheduanna's poetry, especially the hymn can be really considered a sustained reflection on this goddess of paradox, which is what makes these hymns more, I think, than just liturgies to some god or other. They're really intellectually very powerful as well, because the goddess that they're dealing with is so strange. Now, it's also worth noting that Inanna was the patron goddess of the empire. So there's a political overtone. Like, she's not just celebrating any goddess, she's also celebrating the goddess of the empire, the goddess of her father's empire. And the last of the texts attributed to Enheduanna is the temple hymns. And so that is a collection of 42 relatively short hymns. They are like 7 lines to 23 lines. And those are hymns, again, these titles are great, hymns to the temples of all of these cities.
Archaeology does titles, I feel, very, very well.
And then
Very
sometimes
well.
sometimes great and sometimes terribly. Like Epic of Creation, but temple hymns, very good. And yeah, it's actually interesting. Dialogue of Pessimism, but anyway, that's a longer story. But yeah, so these are all of these cities that were gathered in the empire. And the hymns go through them one by one, addressing the temple, but also the god who lived in that temple and the city in which the temple stood. So I like to say that they're kind of like a whistle-stop tour through Sumer. You get all of 8 lines here, 8 lines here. It's like, being on a very, very speedy tour guide.
Do we know why these texts were written? Did they have a purpose, or was it just the joy of creating literature?
So these questions, which are more about the reality behind the text, that depends a lot on whether you think they were written by Enheduanna herself or whether they were written later in her name. And so, just to sketch this question briefly, about 5 centuries separate Enheduanna's lifetime from the time when these poems were written down. Now, it is perfectly possible that those poems were just either survived in an oral form that we can't recover now, or just that the tablets of the intervening centuries are just lost. So it's perfectly possible that Enheduanna herself composed these texts. They would have been adjusted linguistically because the Sumerian language changed a lot in those 500 years. But again, we do see that with other texts, that they survive over those centuries and just are changed to reflect the Sumerian of the day. So it's perfectly possible. But it's also possible that they were written later in her name because she was a famous high priestess. And especially the exaltation and the hymn, they contain these autobiographical sections where Enheduanna talks about her own life, and especially about facing these revolts that ousted her from the city of Ur. So if they were written later, it's kind of like the ancient version of historical fiction, because they are told in her voice in the first person. So that's also an interesting possibility. And I tend to think that this whole discussion around did Enheduanna write them or did she not, it has been a bit overblown, because either way, these poems are fantastic works of literature. Either way, she is an incredibly interesting figure in literary history. And I think we should spend more time looking at the poems than debating did she or did she not, because also, just simply put, the evidence at hand, we can't resolve the question one way or another. So
I just want to add also, I think it's interesting that if she did not write them, very interesting that a woman was chosen as the purported author for these texts. And you, I think, would I think most people who have done any kind of research into the ancient world would say that that's somewhat unusual, given how little we have from women in terms of both literature, but also just writing records, daily records. So even if she did not actually write them herself, the fact that it was viewed as plausible that she could have written them, I think is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like in this case, it's very much the thought that counts. It's not necessarily the reality of did she or did she not. It's the very idea of an attribution to her. And that idea is striking on two levels. First, I mean, yes, it's cool that she's a female author, but again, this is the first author. Like, just the idea of authorship is born when these texts are attributed to her, whether correctly or incorrectly. And that's especially interesting with the exaltation of Inanna, which is her best known work, which not only is this the first poem that is linked to a real historical individual whose name we know and whose life we can sort of recover, but also the text itself contains a depiction of authorship. It contains a depiction of Enheduanna writing the poem we have been reading. So authorship really begins with her. But also, as you say, it is really interesting that it is attributed to a woman. And we might get into some of the like gender dynamics around Enheduanna later. But it is also worth noting that, you know, in the Old Babylonian period, which is when these copies of the text are from, like the goddess of writing was a goddess, not a god as in later periods. And there is more evidence from this period than from later times of female literacy. And generally, you know, you have these high priestesses who are in a fairly high position of power, and so on and so forth. So this is also a period where women did have more access to power and to writing than in some other periods of ancient Near Eastern history.
So the exaltation of Inanna, I think, is one of my favorite ancient literary compositions, and I think a lot of other people feel similarly. And what I enjoy particularly about it is that we do have the voice of an author, because that is not really something that happens a lot in the ancient world. Obviously, you have bits of it in Homer's work, and it pops up in other places, but this is the first real instance, I think, where we have not an inner monologue, but a narrative of a person and their thoughts and feelings and what's going on in their world. Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. You know, this is one of my favorite poems in the entire world. I love it so much, which is also why I've spent so many years working on it. But you're definitely right. And I don't think I'd articulated in that way to myself before, but you're right that one of the things that is so powerful about this poem is this sense of almost like stream of consciousness. And I know that's a modern term, you can't apply it exactly, but still you get this sense that that is somebody thinking through their situation, and the poem jumps a lot. Like the lines come in this like heady succession of like association from one image to another, as in Enheduanna, or the character in Enheduanna is struggling to make sense of her situation, is struggling to make sense of this goddess that she is singing to, and you know, those associations. And if you read the text, you really sort of like jump from one image to the next. In one line, Inanna is described as this, you know, flood that rushes down the mountains. In the next, she's a rain of fire, and then she's, you know, playing with the storms. So, and those, you know, they come thick and fast, those metaphors. But also, if you read the original, they are bound together by these very, very elegant poetic patterning of sounds and words. Sumerian is not just a dead language, it's a very dead language. It died out 4,000 years ago. So we can't trace those oral patterns quite as much as we would like. But just looking at how it's preserved in cuneiform, you can really see a lot of play of words that binds this otherwise. So again, stream of consciousness, somewhat scatterbrained poem together. And you can really see that at first it appears so fiery, so chaotic, so bombastic. But if you spend time with it, and I have, then you can really see how elegantly and delicately it's constructed. So just like to sketch out the narrative real quick, this is a poem about Enheduanna, the character who has been put in exile by a rebellion that has taken place in the city of Ur, led by the rebel leader Lacunae, who may or may not be a real historical person. That's, you know, maybe for later. But she then prays to the god that she has served as high priestess, as she would, and this is to Nanna, the moon god, and he doesn't answer her. He does not answer her prayers. He does not react. And so she turns instead to Nanna's daughter, Inanna. These names can be a bit confusing. And asks Inanna to take Nanna's place as a judge among gods and rule in her favor in this contest between herself and Lugalane. And though that's why it's called the exaltation of Inanna, because this is a hymn, a very, very powerful hymn to Inanna in order to exalt her among the gods so that she will be in a position of power to decide this human conflict that is going on. So that's the narrative scene. Right, that's what's going on. But then what happens is that as Enheduanna is praising Inanna and really putting her everything into getting this notoriously fickle, notoriously difficult goddess to help her, she loses her powers of speech. And she says that her honey mouth has become froth and that her sweet words have turned to dust. So it's also a poem about a crisis of poetry, a crisis of eloquence. And so that is why we get this resolution at the end when Enheduanna finally manages to reclaim her poetic gift, reclaim her poetic power, and sing the hymn that we have been reading. And so that's why it has this like sort of self-referential or like auto-authorial moment when we read about her composing the text we've been reading, which is, I think, just wonderful.
It's the whole thing is beautiful and fascinating, and I absolutely love it. You mentioned a little bit earlier about the use of language in the original Sumerian. When you're translating such an ancient piece of literature that we don't have really a recoverable spoken form of, how difficult is it to try and maybe not preserve, but maybe recreate some kind of rhythm or rhythm is the best way to put it when you're translating, but also stay true to translating the sense accurately?
Yeah, I mean, one question is, what is the sense? Like, Sumerian is in general a very difficult language, and Enheduanna's Sumerian is one of the most difficult Sumerians. She really stretches and strains what the language can do, really pushes the poetic possibilities of Sumerian to the point where translators and philologists today can read the same line in directly opposite ways. And there are some really interesting examples of that where you maybe think that the poem allows for those contradictory possibilities, but there are so many things where just people are debating the basic semantic sense of this. But you are right, like this is a poem of great poetic power. How does one render that in translation? So when I was translating Gilgamesh, I felt very satisfied with striking a balance between recreating some of the lyrical effects in Gilgamesh, but still having, what I would call a real translation that is, close enough to the semantic sense. With Enheduanna, that was much more difficult, in part because the Sumerian is so challenging, and in part because these poetic effects are just wild. So what I did is that on the website inheduanna.org/exaltation, you can find a full breakdown of each and every line in the exaltation with like full commentary of some of the difficulties involved and a much more literal translation. Whereas in the book, you will find a more poetic attempt to render what I see as the intensity of the original and the beauty of the original. One thing that I did that sort of marks this as a less literal translation, less faithful translation perhaps, is that I decided to introduce new line breaks, so I don't follow where the original lines break. And that's because, with the Sumerian, you have maybe 8 syllables, but those 8 syllables pack so much information into
So
them.
much meaning. It can
And
stay on one line.
yeah, and like in English, it becomes 20 words, and it's like that didn't feel fair. So I decided to chop the lines and make them shorter because I feel like that gave the poem the sort of like dizzying intensity that I feel that it has in the Sumerian.
Wonderful, thank you. We are going to start taking audience questions now. We're going to go for approximately 15 more minutes. So if you have questions for Sophus, please put them in the chat of whatever platform you're watching on. So in the publication, do you speculate on the content of the lacuna? And for those who don't know, lacuna is where you have a cuneiform text and there's a chunk of text that's either missing or illegible, or we just don't know what it says. So it can be quite difficult then to try and reconstruct what's in that gap.
For sure. So the exaltation of Inanna is one of the only cuneiform pieces of poetry that is preserved in its entirety, which is like, if you work in cuneiform poetry, like, what? A text without breaks? With Gilgamesh, of course, there's 2/5 of the text are missing. That's much more representative of cuneiform poetry in general. But with the hymn of Inanna and with the temple hymns, there are frequent breaks, and there I to a large part rely on previous philological work to reconstruct lacunae where a few words are missing, but I don't go into attempting to guess at what longer lacunae would have held. Now there's a lacuna or a break, a fragmentary section in the hymn to Inanna that is particularly unfortunate because, as I was saying, one of the interesting things about the exaltation is that it has this hymn to Inanna, and then it has this autobiographical story of Enheduanna's struggles and her eventual solution. And in the hymn, we get this hymn to Inanna that is just like really, as I said, engages with her paradoxical nature and does some amazing work with that. And then you find the line, "I am Enheduanna, I am the high priestess," and then just a huge break. And I typically, I tell people when I'm talking about cuneiform poetry, oh, don't be so frustrated by the fragments. Don't be so frustrated by the breaks. They can be really beautiful in their own way. But this one is just...
This is just pure frustration.
This one is just if it had broken a line earlier, I wouldn't know.
So it wouldn't, yeah.
I would not have this frustration. It is as if it is placed to annoy me.
Yep, it's there and it will never, you can't unsee that information.
But maybe one day, and that day might be tomorrow for all I know, we will recover some of the fragments, which is again such an interesting part.
It's the beauty of Assyriology, I think. There is so much still untranslated and still under the ground that there is always the possibility that we'll find something that will fill in a gap.
Yeah, for sure.
We have another question asking if the controversy over who wrote texts that we attribute to Inanna is as bad as the controversy over who wrote Shakespeare's plays.
That's really interesting comparison, because often the comparison that is made in the scholarship is to Homer, and that's quite a bad comparison, because with Homer, the discussion is whether Homer existed, and that's not the discussion with Enheduanna. We know she was a real historical person. We know she really was the high priestess. It is different from Shakespeare's plays because Shakespeare is not in the plays. He's not a character in the plays. Perhaps another comparison might be the Legends of Arthur, who is both a sort of real person potentially, but also a mythical figure. But again, that comparison doesn't quite work either. I think the controversy over Shakespeare's plays perhaps has more conspiratorial nature than
I was going to say, I didn't think that was actual controversy, but I'm not a Shakespearean, so...
Yeah, I'm not well placed to speak to that.
Well, thank you. Do we know how the personal devotion Enheduanna felt for Inanna developed? Because she seems much more passionate towards Inanna than towards Nana, who is obviously the deity that she is employed by, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, for sure. So it's worth noting that today, if you are a priest or a rabbi or an imam, you are expected to have a particularly strong faith. That is sort of part of the job description. That's a weird way of putting it, but typically these religious professions, they come out of a vocation and a calling, and that is not necessarily the case for priests in the ancient world, where being a priest, being a high priestess, is as much a question of resource management as of piety. There isn't that sense that you have to really believe in this deity in order to serve them. So it's not unusual in itself for these, priests to have to work for one god, but perhaps have a closer connection to another. But in Enheduanna's case, it's also again interesting, as I said, that the disc shows that this is not just a literary fiction. It is actually the case that the real historical person had this affiliation with Inanna. But the reasons, I think, are very political. It was the patron deity of her father's empire. But again, if she really did write these works, like the hymn to Inanna, I've alluded to this exploration of paradox a number of times, but just to go a little more into that, the poem has this middle section where Enheduanna lists all of these contradictory characters that Inanna has. That Inanna is the goddess of triumph and failure. She is, there's this litany of various things that end with "are yours, Inanna." So turning brutes into weaklings and strong men into weak men into strong are yours, Inanna. To make valleys into mountains and mountains into valley are yours, Inanna. And to turn women into men and men into women are yours, Inanna. So if these poems can be taken as a reflection of the real person's interest in the goddess, then this is an exaltation of Inanna, not just as, let's say, a goddess of sex, but specifically as a goddess of change, transformation, and contradiction and paradox. And, the exaltation seeks to make Inanna this, ruler among gods who can help Enheduanna. But the hymn is even more extreme in its exaltation. It really makes Inanna the main supreme goddess, second to none. And that's not usual for cuneiform literature. She's really exalted in a way she's not anywhere else, and it's great. And that's like a theological argument. This goddess is supreme. It's a political argument because the goddess is connected to an empire. But it's also an argument about reality. If you say the goddess of change and contradiction and paradox is the main goddess, then you're also saying that the world is ruled fundamentally by those kinds of forces. It's also an argument about the kind of world we live in.
Thank you. And I on a personal note, this just pinged in my brain. Inanna is attributed with Sargon becoming king. Yes, in the Sargon birth legend, she finds him and raises him up from a gardener or something. So like there's the change in fortune there.
A high priestess being the mother of Sargon as well, but that's not in Enheduanna specifically, because
no. No, that's separate. It was just it popped in my brain. I was like, I should share that. So another question: there has been speculation that the rise and fall of Enheduanna is a precursor for the biblical story of Job. Do you have an opinion on this?
I do not.
No, me neither.
I hadn't heard that. It's I don't know specifically, and I know very little about biblical literature in general. That's maybe more your area of specialty, but I know that there is a speculation about the Ludl Belnemiki, Babylonian story of the righteous sufferer, as a precursor for the story of Job. Now, whether there is a connection between Enheduanna and Ludl, like that's the route you would have to go, that's a very difficult question. You can't point to a direct connection, but Enheduanna does articulate the motif of somebody who is in deep distress and is praying to their deity in a way that had literary repercussions. But we are just now starting to understand those literary repercussions, even within like Sumerian to Akkadian literature, let alone Akkadian to biblical.
Thank you.
So either way, the line wouldn't be direct, but it is possible that some sort of domino effect.
There's a zigzag there somewhere. So we know where Enheduanna's servant's tomb is, the hairdresser, but do we know where her tomb is?
So, I mean, yes and no. Yes, we know where she would have been buried, but no, we haven't recovered it. And like, we won't, unfortunately. So the high priestesses, they would have been buried in Enheduanna's time, probably under the Giparu, as it's called, or the Ngepar in Sumerian, which is the temple in which, or the house, the building in which the high priestess lived. And this is generally the practice in the ancient Near East, that people older family members are buried
Very
underneath the
yeah.
floorboards. But that is also the case for these high priestesses. And the high priestesses sort of form a community over time where one high priestess would provide offerings of food and drink for the previous high priestesses who were buried underneath the house in which she lived. And that is because the high priestesses were not allowed to have children. And that is, again, like, that's really crucial in a cuneiform context, because
Mhm.
so much of your expectations for the afterlife revolved around your children uh, offering you food and drink. So the high priestesses sort of form an alternative family structure, you might say. And later, because I suppose they ran out of floorboards, the cemetery was moved to outside the Dnipro, or the Giparo, and we have a later high priestess writing about reconstructing this area and arranging it. I think Enheduanna, like, this is not certain, but I think Enheduanna would have been buried on the Dnipro. So we know where. I can point it on a map, but we
But we don't have her tomb exactly. Thank you. Do we have any commentaries on Enheduanna's hymns from later periods?
So yes and no. So there are two things that are really interesting here. One is the lexical series Erim Hush, and Kaida Buddy has written some really interesting stuff about this, following an original suggestion by Piotr Michalovsky. So Erim Hush is a lexical list. This is the favorite genre of cuneiform poetry, favorite to cuneiform scholars and pretty much no one else. So these are basically long lists of words, and there are a lot of really interesting intellectual stuff happens in them, but they just do look like long list of words. And Edim Hush has these sections that seem to be built on the hymn to Inanna. So mining words from, or composed in dialogue with the hymn, mining words from the hymn, and offering Akkadian translations and such. So that's one sort of commentary. That's an engagement with the like lexical level.
Mhm.
These words in the text. Also, what we have that is really interesting is a translation into Akkadian of the hymn to Inanna. And that's just wonderful. Like, it's also wonderful as a translator. Like, it's kind of, I feel, almost a permission to translate, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
Like, because they were doing it themselves, and they were also doing it quite freely. So this actually happened. Like, I was sitting there translating, and I'm like, am I deviating too much from the original? And then I looked at the translation, like, no, this is also free
No,
stuff.
this is fun.
It's fine. I can do it too. And it's because there are these like intense word plays in the original, and the Akkadian translation recreates the text sense for sense, but also very much wordplay for wordplay.
Thank you. Is Enheduanna attributed, or the authorship of the Descent of Inanna attributed to Enheduanna?
It is not. So besides the 5 poems that I mentioned above, so that's the exaltation, the hymn, the temple hymns, and these 2 fragmentary sections, there is another text that was attributed to Enheduanna by modern scholars. So not by the ancient scholars, but by modern scholars. And that's Inanna and Ebich. That's not the same as the Descent of Inanna, just to be clear. Inanna and Ebich, I don't see any reason to connect that with Enheduanna.
It's a fun one, though. It's a
It's a
fun.
wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful one. And like, there are references to the myth of Inanna and Ebich throughout in Enheduanna's
Mhm.
poems. This is the story of Inanna, who gets very angry at a mountain because the mountain doesn't bow down to her. How mountains bow is perhaps a little bit of a mystery to me, but she gets angry and absolutely just destroys it, just goes to town on this mountain. And that's the extent of the story. It's
Yeah.
just Kill Bill if Bill was a mountain.
JS is asking, did the god Nana have a blue beard?
I don't know the answer to that
I don't
question.
know either. I want to say yes, but I don't have any evidence to back that up. So let's go with maybe.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, if
Um,
it would have been lapis lazuli,
yeah.
which is a color that some gods are said to have, and he is the moon god, so maybe.
Does the exaltation of Inanna follow a typically religious pattern, or is it more personal than usual? To me, it seems almost as though it's a kind of love poetry in some parts.
So I think the thing about the exaltation of Inanna is that it mixes a lot of different genres. So one of the religion patterns that it does follow is the structure, the kind of text that is known as lamentation poetry. So without going into too much detail, lamentations were written in both Sumerian and yeah, mainly in Sumerian, because it was thought that the gods would sometimes impose disaster on the human population just to show how strong they were. And so, by lamenting this theoretical disaster that was imposed, you would show the gods, I appreciate that you are very, very strong. You don't need to prove this in practice. So, lamentation poetry becomes its own genre. And the exaltation borrows a lot of tropes and a lot of lines, a lot of phrase from lamentation. It also borrows from like legal language. And when the main edition of the exaltation came out, it was called Der Rechtsfall der Enheduanna, so the court case of Enheduanna. That's by Annette Skull. And so that shows you how much legalese is sort of like woven into this poem. And then there are these like moments of pure dedication that absolutely feel like love poetry at moments. Enheduanna and Inanna, when Enheduanna finally writes this poem that she's been trying to write, the two of them, the priestess and the goddess, they meet in this place called the Holy Inn, which is the name, of course, of one of Inanna's temples, but it's also quite suggestive. The inn as a place of intoxication and perhaps of sensuality, and they meet there at the dead of night. So there is, without without speculating too much or being too salacious about it, there's a hint of some kind of intimate connection between goddess and priestess.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more question, then we're going to let you go. Do you think Enheduanna has been overlooked as an historical person because of her relationship to Inanna, similar to how a lot of Gilgamesh was overlooked because of the sensationality of the flood tablet?
I don't know that Gilgamesh was overlooked except for the flood tablet. Definitely, the flood tablet was the way Gilgamesh became famous, but it wasn't so much overlooked before the discovery of the flood tablet, just because nothing was looked at. These was the very early days of cuneiform. Cuneiform had been deciphered only for about 35 years when Gilgamesh was discovered, which is, reading it like that makes that sound wild. But anyway, why has Enheduanna been overlooked is a great question. And I think one has to break that down a bit. On the one hand, I want to say that there is no grand conspiracy. There is nobody like being like, oh, let's keep knowledge of Enheduanna away from people. But at the same, and like the first translation of Enheduanna's poem, The Exaltation, comes out in 1968, which is a long time ago. It's also quite a telling year, with student revolts and
Yeah.
but she has been in the public domain for a while, but there has been very little attention to her. And that includes in the scholarly realm. Now, one of the reasons for that is just that, as I said, her Sumerian is really, really difficult. So that does put people off. And also, Assyriology is a philological discipline, and it's sometimes a somewhat traditionally oriented philological discipline. And in philological disciplines, people really care about dating and authorship and establishing when was a text written, what context does it come from. And within Enheduanna, there are so many unknowns. We don't know, is this 2300 BC or 1800 BC? That's a huge gap. Is this really Enheduanna or not? And so all of these questions mean that philologists who approach the text with sometimes, not always, but sometimes very like historically minded, they're like, this text is confusing. We don't quite know what to do with it. Now, I approach it just as a literary critic, and I think there's so much like of literary interest in the text that, again, regardless of when it dates to, it's a fascinating poem. Enheduanna is a fascinating figure. Again, whether this is historical fiction or autobiography or pseudo autobiography. So that is another thing that has kept Enheduanna perhaps not being as popularized as maybe should have been the case. But it is also hard. At the end of the day, it is hard to escape the sense that there has not been as much interest in her because she's a woman, but it's so difficult to quantify,
Yeah.
like how much do these factors weigh up against each other? I don't know. I definitely think that it really is Enheduanna's moment right now, and I'm very honored to be able to contribute to that. There's so much interest in her out there,
Mhm.
and that's just amazing to see. People are really ready for an Enheduanna revival, and the exhibit that is on in New York at the Morgan Library is just one of many examples. Definitely, if you're in the New York area, go check that out. It's amazing. But yeah, this is Enheduanna's year.
Well, thank you, Sophus, so much. And if you have watched this and you're interested in Enheduanna, Sophus has a website, enheduanna.org, I believe.
Yes, in
Yep.
Enheduanna.org, and there you will find this line-by-line translation of the exaltation. I will one day in the future add a similar translation of the hymn, and you will also find resources to learn more about Enheduanna and about Sumerian, and so on and so forth. And then I have like a 10-page like wiki kind of thing where you can read about the basic topics that you need to know in order to engage with Enheduanna's poems.
And I have to say, the line-by-line translation is invaluable, even if you're not interested in Enheduanna specifically, but for showing how translation works. I think it's something that a lot of people maybe don't have a firm grasp on, because unless it's something you've done, it's quite hard to explain. But that will really, you can go and look through it, and it will give you a really good idea of quite how complicated translating can be sometimes. It's not just this word means this and this word means this. It's a lot more complex than that. And Sophus' book, Enheduanna, The Complete Poems of the World's First Author, will be out in 2023. Do you have a month for us?
March 28th.
March.
So,
Month and day. Wonderful.
March 28th, 3 days before my birthday.
Oh, perfect. Early birthday present. So keep your eyes out for that one. Excuse me. Sorry. We are all recovering from the flu, so I've been coughing intermittently. And that is everything from me. Sophus, is there anything you want to add before we say goodbye?
I mean, I'm always happy to be sharing my enthusiasm for Enheduanna, and I think part of what's great about sharing my love for these ancient texts is just to see people's reactions. Especially with Gilgamesh, people react to Gilgamesh in such personal, powerful ways, and see all sorts of aspects of the text that resonates with them personally. So being a translator of Enheduanna is a really great experience, because I get to be there when people discover the text, sometimes for the first time, often for the first time. And I love seeing people's reactions. So, please post in the comments what Enheduanna means to you, what aspects of her poems mean something to you. I'd love to hear about that, because that's really what interests me, how differently people see her.
Well, thank you very much for that, audience. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.